So a couple of years ago, when I started preaching every Sunday, I noticed a problem with our Easter plans. And that's that there's not enough time between Palm Sunday with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and then the resurrection to do justice to this story. Because what takes place that week changed everything for everyone who's ever lived. There's always something that we don't talk about much that stands out to me about this week where Jesus suffered beyond what our imaginations can hold, and that is simply how present Jesus is. No matter what was going on, he takes time to sit with his disciples, to share meals and tell parables. He heals and frees the people that he meets, and he stops for conversation, and at the center of it, he prays for his disciples and for himself. He washes his disciples' feet, and he tells them what's coming, even though he knows that they're going to spend the rest of their lives working to comprehend the chain of events that began as he rode that colt into Jerusalem. So a couple of years ago, as I was working through the portion of the story that I wanted to tell on Easter Sunday, I realized that I simply wanted to tell the story of Jesus, God with us. But then I ran into the challenge of whose perspective I wanted to tell it from. Because perspective matters, and we have a lot of choices here. When we open the Bible to Matthew, the Jesus we find is the long-awaited Messiah, the answer to pain and consequence and confusion. When we read Mark's gospel, we see Jesus' sacrifice come alive with a little less emphasis on his teaching and more emphasis on his actions. Luke's Jesus is the merciful Jesus who taught in parables and healed and made time for the people that others never made time for. And John gives us God in human form. But the Jesus I know, the Jesus who speaks to me and who walks with me and who ordains my steps, is all of those things. The Jesus I know is the man who wept and the God who made a way, the man who suffered and the God who overcame. So this year, as I was again deciding what to preach for Easter, I found I was struggling with the same problem that I faced a couple of years ago when the beauty and the complexity of this story that we carry in our hands and in our hearts overwhelms the limits of a sermon. And maybe I'm here again because this year we as a congregation have been walking a different kind of path. It's a path that has asked for our willingness and our obedience, and then for us to get out of the way and watch God at work in the world. It's a path that's called us to recognize God with us. But in this process, we've learned that getting out of the way isn't inactive by any means. And that's because stepping off the road and into the edge of the woods so we can turn to watch what God is sending down the path demands soul-searching courage and a constant reorienting of our hearts so that we can respond according to Jesus' example. It's the most active inaction I think I've ever encountered. It's hard. It's death to self. And it means letting go and blindly trusting footholds we didn't even know were there a few minutes ago. It means relying on our weakness instead of our strengths, because we are reminded by Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:9, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell within me." So a couple of years ago, when I encountered this problem of whose voice to use to tell the story of God with us, I decided to combine what we know from a number of the Gospels and tell the story from the perspective of Mary Magdalene. That way, we see Jesus, the Messiah, and the man. And I chose her because if you think about it, her story is all of our stories. You see, she's someone Jesus found and delivered. And she was loved by him for who she was, not according to the labels that other people put on her. And if you're here today and you know what it's like to have your identity restored to the identity that God intended, you understand why for the rest of her life she followed Jesus. The thing is, there's so much about life that we simply can't comprehend. There's pain and there's loss and joy and healing and misunderstandings and restoration. But when we have been seen by Jesus and we encounter the kind of love that keeps no record of wrongs, the love that's patient and the love that's kind, a kind of love that, if we're honest, we have always longed for, we cling to it. And sometimes it's hard to do that. And it might be because life has been difficult, and when we're in that valley, it's easy to forget for a moment the power of that kind of love. Or sometimes the people God chooses to work through to be the example of love haven't stewarded that responsibility well. But today we're here, and you're here. And that's because the image of God that's imprinted in our DNA, it calls us home. Not necessarily to this building, but home to where love is found. So today, I'm not going to preach. I'm not going to tell you what I think you should think or how you should think. I'm not going to try to prove the gospel. But what I am going to do is I'm going to share Mary's story because I think it's all our stories. And we're going to celebrate a kind of love that we'll honestly never be able to fully comprehend, but one that, when it finds us, we know we're home. I open my eyes to the still black early morning hours of Sunday. I awake. But that's not new. I've been awake for days, maybe. Right now, time goes fast and slow, all at once. We doze in bits of stolen, guilty moments of unconsciousness, waking with a start, disoriented for a few panicked moments until the past week comes flooding back. The Sabbath of yesterday, so different from that just a week ago, when he still sat with us, laughed with us, watched us like he always did, his knowing eyes making us all feel like we're the only ones in the room. To know those eyes are closed, that I will never be looked at like that again. I don't know where to put a loss like that. He told us when we sat at the Sabbath table, we would do so in remembrance of him. I don't think any of us had any idea how true that would be. Yesterday, all we could think of was him. The way he had broken the bread, the way he had passed the cup. So we ate together, the place where he should be enormously empty. Eating the bread and drinking the wine in silence as we tried to make sense of the past week, as each of us remembered the bits of conversations that should have helped us see this coming. But we were too drawn up into the excitement of the crowd, too distracted by the expectations and the hope, too energized by the possibility that Jesus would be the one to restore Israel. We were too blinded by what we wanted to protect him. We should have stopped him as he rode the colt into Jerusalem. We should have found a way to shield him. But instead, we paved the way with our cloaks and our worship. It felt so right at the time. But now, I still don't understand how it turned. How did we ignore the soldiers watching? How did we not see how well the Pharisees had plotted? They killed him as a criminal. And I am humiliated to admit that my hands have been shaking for days, wondering if I'll be next. So I roll to my side and close my eyes against the still black sky. I breathe in, one deep breath in and letting it out, feeling my lungs completely empty, like Jesus's. My chest spasms as I suck in another breath, trying to forget that moment of emptiness, trying not to think of Jesus lying in the tomb, his chest still, the breath that carried the words that had raised others from the dead gone and silenced. Death brings such silence, but his message carried such life. He was our teacher. I should have listened better. I open my eyes and stare into the darkness at the shadows that loom in the corners of my room, but all I have to do is close my eyes. And I can remember how it felt when he looked at me. We should have known. Everything he did wasn't what we expected him to do. The things the other rabbis found beautiful, Jesus pointed out their ugliness. The things the other rabbis found fault with, Jesus saw the beauty. We should have known. For him, the rich were poor and the weak were strong. And now the most alive person I have ever known lies still and cold, buried under the silence of the stone tomb. A week ago, he said the stones would shout if we didn't. The stones would testify. I never realized how that silence would testify so loudly to our failure. It feels like the entire earth is mute, and the silent stones in the walls are screaming our guilt. Like we all took a breath in and then out and then forgot to breathe in again. The skies went dark when he died, and even though the sun returned, without him here, how will I ever feel warm again? Why aren't the stones crying out? Why isn't the world crying out? How can I lie here in this bed, motionless, when my Lord was just dragged through town like a criminal, whipped, mocked, and hung on a cross? It should have been me hanging there for not stopping it. How did we miss it? He chastised the priests, the scribes, and the leaders. He challenged the Pharisees when he stepped into the temple courts, into the place designated for Gentiles to pray, and found the money changers making prayer impossible, and the sellers charging the poor too much for the doves to sacrifice. He drove them away and then laid hands on the sick and healed the ones the priests refused to serve. We should have known how he would plot against him, what they would do. But we just kept moving forward. So astounded by the miracles, we couldn't comprehend the message that he would be leaving. How could he have allowed this? He could have freed us from Rome with a word. I know this. He could have stopped them. He knew Judas would betray him. Why didn't he stop him? It's still dark outside. So I try to find comfort in the familiar scratch of the linen against my skin and the lingering scent of the dinner I ate but didn't taste. He knew what was coming, and he did nothing to stop it. And if I'm honest, I'm angry. I'm angry at those who plotted against him. I'm angry at the crowds that worshiped him and then shouted to crucify him. I'm angry at Judas for betraying him, for betraying us all. And I'm angry at him for leaving us like this. But most of all, I'm angry at myself for not stopping it. When they came to arrest him, it was Judas who betrayed him with a kiss. And they took him away, armed as if he would try to destroy them. And I think it was the confusion that hurt the most. We'd spent years following him, watching him gently lift those who couldn't walk to their feet with only his words and maybe a touch. We knew him as the man who would kneel down to speak to a child and then listen as if their response was the most interesting thing he could possibly hear all day. He openly wept when his friend's family, with the family when his friend died. And then, without great speeches or elaborate ceremonies, he raised him from the dead. Before they came to arrest him, Jesus had spent the night in prayer, sweating drops of blood, crying out to God because he knew what would happen. He didn't leave before they came like any of us would have, like any of us wanted him to. He knew he was a prophet, a messenger from God. He could have called down the angels to protect himself. He could have called us to protect him. I'd have gladly traded my life for his. Does the world have any idea what they lost? He didn't look surprised when they came, just resigned to what we didn't know. Peter especially didn't know. He went after the high priest's slave with a sword and cut his ear off. No one expected that. Well, no one but Jesus, I suppose, because he simply told Peter, "No more of this," and touched the man's ear, healing it instantly. How could they still take him after that? Sleep. That's impossible. I sit up, willing the cool night air seeping in through the cracked door to clear my thoughts. Everything in me wants to scream at them for allowing this to happen, but mostly I want to scream at myself. But I don't have the energy because I'm not really angry. I miss my friend. So I stare dry-eyed into the darkness. I've already spent every tear on regret. We didn't know what to do after they took him. He'd been our center for so long. He'd called us to follow him, and so we did, hundreds of us, sometimes thousands, each of us feeling like we were the only one, like his message was just for us. Every sentence he spoke to the multitudes was a conversation. But then, the real conversations, when it was just him and me, I remember every word and every glance. The way he tilted his head when he thought something was funny, or when he waited for me to understand the message behind the words. Those moments are burned in my heart. Every drop of blood singing through my veins is branded with him. I wish I knew how to describe what it was like to sit with him. Like all of history collapsed into the moment where he met my gaze. Like everything I had ever done and everything I will ever do was there, not in an overwhelming way, but in a way that made everything make sense, where every confusion found a home and evaporated into nothing. They took him away. And we scattered, afraid we might be next. If they could take our Lord, what could they do to us? So we moved to the outskirts of the crowd. For so long we had surrounded Jesus, and it was the chief priests and scribes and all the others who wanted him gone that weaved in and out between us, calculating and plotting against him. In a moment that changed. The Pharisees, the priests, and the scribes moved to the center, and we let it happen. We allowed ourselves to be pushed back, and without that nearness, many of the people who had been following Jesus, who had watched the miracles and shouted their praise, many who had hoped he would be our Messiah, started again to listen to the powers that they had always listened to. In an instant, everything changed, and it was us who weaved between, trying to catch a glimpse, ashamed that we were hoping that we wouldn't be discovered. And all the times he'd warned us of in this moment, the things we couldn't comprehend and didn't want to believe, they came flooding back. He had had just washed our feet earlier that day and told us that we wouldn't understand until later. He warned us that one of us would betray him and another deny him. We didn't want to believe him. But that night they illegally took him before the council and put him on trial for some of the things he'd said. There they accused him, misused his words, and made false claims. His response was silence. I think what I might remember most about those days was the silence. Not from the crowds. I'd never heard noise like that in my life, and I hope to never hear it again. Jesus' silence, though, that's what I remember. Because even when he spoke, it was as if no one had heard. Their self-interest and hate had made them deaf to everything else but their own disappointment and anger. Then Caiaphas, the high priest, with scorn dripping from his words, asked Jesus if he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. That question, Jesus answered. He said, I am. And then clarified his claim and enraged the priest by using phrases out of Deuteronomy and Psalms. Jesus told him, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with clouds of heaven. The priest tore his clothes in protest and anger and frankly in pageantry. He called Jesus' words blasphemy, and they decided that our Lord deserved to die, and that's when the beating began. This time, my own silence roared in my ears. They gritted their teeth and clenched their fists. And when the first punch hit Jesus, the wind left my lungs. I couldn't take a breath in. I stood there like a statue, watching him take blow after blow, knowing I should stop it, but paralyzed by my own fear and disbelief. Just days ago, these people had been praising him. And they didn't stop. They spat on him and then blindfolded him, the man who had returned sight with only a touch. They tied a cloth around his face so he couldn't see who struck him, and then they told him to prophesy, to tell him who had dealt the blow. He was crumpled on the ground. And I don't know if he was conscious when I turned away. Friday dawned, and they dragged him before Pilate. He'd already been betrayed and denied by those who loved him, and we all stood there, stunned into silence, watching the day unfold like a nightmare. It would get so much worse than we could have ever imagined. Pilate asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews, and Jesus answered, his bruises growing darker by the minute, you say so. But when the priests made more accusations, Jesus remained silent. I suppose there wasn't a lot left to say. But I wish I would have said something. The priests persisted, blaming Jesus for stirring up the people and telling Pilate that Jesus told them not to pay their taxes. None of that was true. And for a moment, I thought that Jesus might be released when Pilate told the crowds that he couldn't find a basis for the punishment that they were asking for. But the priests insisted, and when Pilate learned that Jesus was from Galilee, in Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem. And Herod didn't mind. For a long time, he was hoping to see the miraculous signs that everyone had been talking about. I could have told him that Jesus wouldn't do that. Miracles that heal and deliver aren't for the entertainment of the rich and the powerful. Any of us could have told him that. But Herod was used to getting his way. So he continued the mocking that hadn't stopped since the night before. When he got bored, he sent him back to Pilate, who told the priests again that our Jesus had done nothing to deserve death. He gave us a choice. Pilate gave the crowd a choice. He would set one prisoner free. We could have Jesus back, or he would release the murderer Barabbas. I couldn't shout loud enough. to be heard over the words, "Crucify him." So Pilate handed him over to be flogged. They dragged him to the center of the crowd, the people jeering and spitting as he stumbled, trying to get a foothold, trying to stand. They stripped him, tied his hands to the post, and began the torture. I've seen people flogged before. Normally, when Romans order the flogging, no one survives. But the Jews limit the number of stripes to 40, like 40 years wandering in the desert, or 40 days of fasting and temptation. It's a mercy that I no longer consider a mercy. By now, he was too exhausted, too beaten to cry out much. The shards of bone and lead cut into his skin, tearing away his flesh until it hung from strips from his back and his shoulders and his legs. It took a while, but eventually the blood pooled around his knees, soaking into the ground. And we took turns holding each other back from rushing in to stop the cruelty. I'll never know that that's the right thing to do. The sky outside is shifting. Shades of violet have finally scaled the ink black of the night sky, and now they seep into my room where I'm supposed to be sleeping. How much longer is this night going to go on? When they were finished with him, they covered him in a purple cloak, the color of royalty, and pressed a crown made of thorns into his head, and then they saluted him, "Hail, King of the Jews." The things they said, no one should ever hear, least of all this humble man. They struck him again and again with reeds this time, driving the thorns further into his brow. And when they finally got bored, they ripped the robe from his shoulders that had been drying and sticking to his wounds, and fresh blood ran to leave drips in the dirt before the crowds that used to praise him trampled it into the ground. They laid a wood cross across his back and pushed him forward. He struggled up the rocky path, dirt and debris clinging to his wounds, the weight of the cross pressing into his shoulders that we had all at one time or another pressed our faces into, weeping in relief from the pain that had been lifted with only a word or the forgiveness that had been found in a simple glance. Each step was slower until the guards grew impatient and impressed a pilgrim to carry the cross instead. I wonder if that man knew Jesus was innocent. I couldn't get close enough to tell if he was angry at being drawn into something he had nothing to do with, or maybe he had the chance to look into Jesus' eyes and to the truth. I hope that he had that moment with Jesus. Why weren't we the ones to carry the cross? Why did it have to be a stranger? But Jesus followed him, and we followed Jesus, no longer hiding, moving with the crowds. We couldn't cover our grief and the simmering outrage that made my heart feel like a stone in my chest. What is the use? I stayed close to his mother, words failing me, but it didn't matter because no one could have heard anything above the shouts and the jeers and the wailing coming from the crowd. They stripped him again, nailed him to the cross, placed a sign over his head that read, "King of the Jews." And when the heavy work of crucifying him was done, and all there was left to do was wait, the soldiers placed bets to see who would be the one to take his clothes. Then we waited. Like I wait now. I wait for the familiar sounds of the world waking up, for the sky to brighten, for the scent of smoke as fires are stoked to life. But no one moves except me. I cross the room and pick up the spices we'd purchased after the sun set on the Sabbath. As soon as the city gates open, we'll anoint Jesus' body. But it's still too early. I sit back down, clutching the bag to my chest, and I continue to wait, willing the familiar scent of the spices to distract me from the ringing in my ears that started when he was taken from us and hasn't stopped. It didn't take long for Jesus to die. Not as far as crucifixions go. He hung there, and we watched. We heard him speak to the criminals that hung on either side of him, the words of compassion he had for the ones who had hung him there. He asked for God's forgiveness for the soldiers. God's forgiveness. And I know he asked for the soldiers and the people who had screamed, "Crucify him." But when he said those words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," I knew in my heart it was me too. God, forgive my lack of understanding. Forgive my inability to help him. Forgive me for not listening closer to every word he said. One of the criminals joined with the guards, mocking him for not saving himself and saving them. But the other one asked Jesus to remember him, and Jesus, his blood still seeping from his wounds, drying in lines down his unrecognizable face and flowing down the grain pattern of the beams that were fashioned into the cross, said, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And then darkness fell and mercifully subdued the jeering crowd. It has to be time. The stars have finally faded. I tie on my sandals, light the lamp, and crack the door open to a morning that's still dark with confusion and something I can't name, but it's disorienting. I close it behind me, clutching the spices, trying not to think of the state of my Jesus' body, trying not to think of him cold, alone, and silent in the tomb. I will never forget the sound of his voice or the way he looked at me. That's forever seared in my mind. But I'm afraid that I'll forget what it felt like to follow him. What it felt like to know I was completely safe. That I was seen. I don't want to forget what it feels like to be seen. I step into the morning air, breathe in the cool dampness of it, and look to the horizon. When the skies turned dark at noon, I could see his silhouette hanging there against the clouds as if the world had lost something, and suddenly everything around me was a flat painting on a wall. I sat on the ground near Mary, Jesus' mother, and John. Her face was a study in exhaustion as she waited for her son's death like the rest of us. I will never understand how the crowds and the soldiers and the priests who had orchestrated things so that Jesus hung on a cross could have dismissed the miracles and wonders they had seen him do and think that when they nailed him there, he was like any other criminal. But then the sky turned black. My eyes had been closed, so I noticed the silence before I noticed the dark that had poured into the pool of the skies, obscuring the priests' faces as their smug expressions of superiority shifted to uncertainty. They glanced back and forth between each other, I imagine trying to calculate how they would explain all of creation rejecting what they had just done. My gaze was glued to their faces, willing them to understand the significance of what they'd done. The hairs on my arms lifted like it does when the lightning is too close, but I didn't move for cover. They should have, though. And then the voice that is like none I will ever know cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The people still standing around the cross, confused by the darkness and the sudden change in atmosphere, they started to whisper, wondering if he was calling to Elijah. I suppose wondering if they'd made a mistake. Yes, I wanted to yell, yes, you have made a mistake. Some women rushed to fill a sponge with bitter wine that would ease his pain and maybe help bring on his death, but Jesus didn't take it. Instead, he cried one more time, and as his last breath slipped from his lungs. I turned from the crowds and watched it. I watched him die. I stood like a statue and watched the life slip out of his body. But the priests and the crowds didn't watch because the ground began to shake. And the rocks split in half, and graves opened, and the dead walked. And the temple curtain that separated us from the Holy of Holies, the place only priests could enter, tore in half, top to bottom, opening the entire temple to everyone and censuring the priests' stranglehold on God's message for all of humanity. Yes, you have made a mistake. I kick a stone out of the road and trudge toward the city gates. I can see the other Mary's shadow in the distance, waiting in the road for me so that we can make our way to his tomb together. When I reach her, our gazes meet. There's no words left to say. We know what has to be done. And we're in that strange place of feeling honored by the duty that's before us, and dread, as we know, we'll be facing what neither of us could ever be prepared to face. The city gates are open, and a soldier starts at our approach. He dismisses us with a glance, and we pull the scarves tighter under our chins and continue on to the tomb. We weave in and out of the other graves until we stand in front of the one where they laid Jesus, our Jesus. I look at Mary. She sees what I'm seeing. The stone's been rolled away. We rush inside, scrambling down the few stone stairs to see the empty slab where he should have been. Where is he? I think those are the first words I've spoken in days. Where is he? Mary's silence is her response, and we hurry out of the cold, empty tomb, trying to hold back the tears. Wasn't it enough to crucify him? Did they have to take him too? We step out of the tomb and stop short. Two men stand in clothes that dazzle like the sun rippling across a lake. I hear Mary sucking a breath, and then we're on our knees. Why do you look for the living among the dead? One of the men says. He's not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again? And suddenly it all floods back. The words he spoke, they come back, and then more. The scrolls that I had heard read as a child, they surge through my consciousness. The prophet Isaiah said that he would be numbered with the criminals. The prophet Zechariah said he would be crucified. In the Psalms, it was prophesied that they would cast lots for his clothing, and the people would stand and mock and sneer at him. Everything happened there. Plainly, how did we not see this? He said he would be raised from the dead on the third day. How did we not hear that? My heart races. We have to tell the 11. I scramble to my feet with the words of Isaiah flooding like a burst dam through my mind. But he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? Hundreds of years ago, Isaiah asked the question for us. He told us we wouldn't see it. We wouldn't be able to see him. His words were written. Who could have imagined his future? Not us. We didn't. I don't know where the men have gone, but I hope Mary is somewhere behind me, because I have to tell John and Peter and Thomas, but then I hear it and I stop. Mary, he says. I smile and close my eyes and breathe in for maybe the first time in days before I answer, "Teacher." And then I turn around to stand in the presence of my Jesus, my friend, my home, my Savior, my Messiah, my Redeemer, my Deliverer, the prophesied King who defeated death, who sees me, who freed me, and who lives.